Hello, and welcome to the Wanderings Podcast, a photographer's exploration of art, science, and world culture. I am your host, Pedro Bonatto, a fine art and advertising photographer based in Toronto, Canada. In this show, I talk to artists, designers, scientists, filmmakers, authors, entrepreneurs, people who are creating inspiring work in a variety of fields. I have been working as a professional photographer and as a musician for a few years, and I'm often inspired by history, science, mythology, and popular culture in the photographs that I create. In this podcast, I try to go a little bit deeper in the stories that inspire me, and I hope will inspire you too. In today's episode, we explore the many intersections between art and science. Great geniuses of the past, from Hypatia of Alexandria in antiquity to Leonardo da Vinci in the Renaissance, used both areas as forms of inquiry and windows into our universe. Over time, they began to get further and further apart, but luckily today, there is a number of people trying to build new bridges between art and science. My guest is Dr. Roberta Buiani, an interdisciplinary artist, a media theorist, and ArtSci curator based in Toronto. Buiani is the co-founder of the ArtSci Salon, hosted at the Fields Institute for Research in Mathematical Sciences. We talked about science popularization, about art inspired by science, and about innovative efforts from artists and scientists to work together in collaborations that inform each other's work. We discussed some of our favorite artists, including the emerging field of bioart, and how art can serve as a tool to investigate the role of science in society. We also talked about an exciting event coming up in April 2018 in Toronto and Ottawa, organized by the ArtSci Salon. If you are in one of those cities, I encourage you to check it out. In 2012, I finished a master's degree at OCAD University that linked my interest in photography and the history of science. I must say that Roberta's work and advice was a shining light that helped guide my way through these usually siloed fields. My goal with this podcast has been to inspire you to follow your curiosity, and I think this was the main theme of today's show. So, here's my conversation with Dr. Roberta Buiani. So, Roberta, thank you for being with me in the podcast today. And I want to start by asking you, first, tell us a little bit about your work in art and science and what you've been up to.
Okay, so right now I self-identify as the art director of the ArtSci Salon, which is a collective of artists and scientists who are interested in initiating dialogue and communication and collaborations between artists and scientists. And of course, people are working with technologies. And we started in 2012, initially in the basement of Interaccess, and then we were taken in by the Fields Institute. So the Fields Institute right now is our host. The Fields Institute is Institute for Research in Mathematical Sciences. But we are not mathematicians, although we have a lot of mathematicians in our audience. But our goal is to initiate dialogues across all sciences, and we discovered that there's actually quite a need for collaboration between art and science. There's a growing network of artists, and I just discovered even in the GTA, I went recently to Vaughan to a panel, and people from Newmarket, from Markham, really want to initiate art and science collaborations. So there's really a hunger for this type of activities. But we started early, and only a couple of years ago we started gaining a momentum, so that from like the usual suspects of like 20-30 people right now, like especially in the last 2 years, we've had an increasing number of people coming to our events. Right now we are counting around like 100 people per time. Yeah, and we had a few full houses and a few sold out events.
How did you start getting into that? Because I know you studied literature back in Italy, right?
Yeah.
And then you came to Toronto and studied art. So what was your path into this interest in art and science?
Okay, so I came to the relationship between art and science through an interest in new media. So I've always been interested in new media. Back in the 90s, when I was doing my BA in Italy in literature, I became very much interested in the rising internet and new technologies. And I spent 1 year in the United States. That's where I learned a lot of technology and a lot of stuff connected with high-tech. But I also realized there was a connection with science. So I went back to Italy. I felt like I was half-baked. I came back to North America, this time to Canada, and I did my MA in art history, and then I was directed to a PhD in communication and cultural studies because my then professors told me, why are you staying in art history? Art history is about that man. You should get into communication. You should get into high tech and communication and cultural studies, not just communication. So communication and cultural studies are the right way to do it. And so I found my way, and I've been interested in stuff that is always at the intersection between art, science, and technologies. For example, I wrote my dissertation on viruses, and it was supposed to be about computer science, computer viruses, but then they became somehow and unavoidably linked to biological viruses. So from this sort of obsession, I started becoming interested in artists who are working with scientists, and I became more and more interested, and I started having these conversations with artists, and I wrote about them, and right now this write-up has become collaboration. And from there, I met my big model, my big mentor, who is Jim Rockstone, who was then the chair of Sado Technologies Festival, which for a long time was the only festival in North America dealing with the relationship between art, science, technologies. Yeah. Now it's changed its course. Now it's more about technologies, but at that point, at that time, it was a lot about the hard sciences, and they had physicists being involved. They had mathematicians. They had biologists, and it was like this really fascinating world that I started pursuing. And when Jim said, "Oh, I think that there's a growing need for this type of activity. Why don't we put together something that happens also during the year instead of having just one festival that happens for a few days?" I said, "Okay, so I'm on board. I want to do this." And of course, like, it took a few years, and now we have the ArtSci Salon, and we are actually expanding now. Hopefully to the GTA, but also to Ottawa next month.
Oh, right.
We are going to Ottawa to do an event. And from what I see, from the buzz that it's been generated, it looks like there's an interest.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I saw this is being recorded in March 2018. So if you're listening to this 2 years from now, sorry you missed it, but I'm sure ArtSci will be around doing other events. But this will happen in April 10th, 11th, and the 12th, and then in Ottawa, I think it's on the 14th.
Yeah, it's a 3 days in Toronto and then 1 day in Ottawa.
Great. Yeah, we'll put all links for that in the show notes and release the podcast before that day so that people can take a look. I remember going to one of the most memorable ones for me of ArtSci Salon was with Nervous System.
Yes.
Yeah, and
that was good.
I'll try to get them to be interviewed in the podcast because they do a lot of work related to biology and related to like 3D printing and fashion, which is something that I'm interested in.
And physics and mathematics too.
Yeah, of course, by definition. So it's very very interesting. Cool. So that's like the beginning for you. Your BA, then your master's, then your PhD, and now the work with ArtSci Salon. And of course, you're interested in biology specifically, right? Can you tell us a little bit about some of the projects you've worked on? I know there are a lot of talks and discussion groups and things that you guys do, but I know you work with both performance art and installations. Can you tell a little bit about the projects you worked on that area?
So there's a philosophy behind it. Initially, we started doing only talks. So our agreement with the Fields Institute was we're going to be in your space and we're going to do a series of talks where we are putting one scientist and one artist in the same room and they will discuss about topics that pertain to both. But this is very... I shouldn't say boring, I should say classic.
Yes.
It's a very traditional way of dealing with this. So you go there and you have PowerPoint presentation and you're talking to the audience. And I thought, well, we are in the Fields Institute, which is this beautiful building with a beautiful staircase. And so the first thing that we did was, there was a guest mathematician who was doing experiments with the flights of insects. And we asked her, do you want to do something artistic? And so she put together this sort of performance where she was really just throwing rice paper pieces off that staircase. And she had experimental pianist playing a modified piano. And the performance consisted in these beautifully colorful paper clips, paper sheets coming down the stair, and they were really flying. They were simulating the flight of insects, and we thought, okay, that's it. We need to do site specific things, and so we started inviting people. Like, for example, the nervous system that you were talking about. They brought their own samples and jewelry and stuff. So people were invited to see what they had. So they put everything on the table. We had fiber artists who brought samples of the fiber they were creating as a tactile material. So people were circulating them across the space. We had people working with food who brought samples of some kind of science fiction food, and then I discovered a couple of years ago. I discovered that because we are inside the University of Toronto, there's a lot of spaces that are very fascinating. That they're either empty or they have some really old instruments that are very dusty, and I thought, what a waste of space. It would be really nice if we repopulated these places, and most of them are cabinets, so they are enclosed behind a glass window. So why don't we repopulate these with art? Especially because these cabinets are always in the proximity of science departments. And we thought, okay, so let's ask first if we can use them. And it was hilarious because in some cases people had lost the keys, they didn't remember them. They had instruments and posters from old conferences from the 80s.
Oh, wow.
And one, actually, I remember one secretary suggesting that I just open it with a pick lock, yes. He said, well, you can open them and use them. So we chose the best that did for us, and we launched this cabinet project. And that was actually the first major project that we did. And it was distributed exhibition across campus. We did some media coverage from university. We had some sponsorship from the various science departments, and in April, actually last year, we launched this exhibition. So basically, people were given a map, and they could go around and check out these cabinets, which had been commissioned to be installed by artists who had chosen instruments from the University of Toronto Scientific Collection, or artists who were inspired by a certain type of science that was in the proximity of these cabinets, or just plain art and science collaboration. Some of them had that historical meaning, so they were actively using old instruments from the 19th century. Some of them were making a commentary about the politics of scientific instruments. So, for example, there was an artist who worked with instruments that were used in the mining industry. So, like, she was making a comment on occupational health. We had artists who were working on the microbiome. We had artists who were doing stuff with the environment. So mud coming from Lake Ontario that was teeming with bacteria, and we're like taking these like fantastic colors and so on and so forth. And we had so much stuff going on, and we had 12 installations.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. We also had and we also started becoming very interested in performance. And again, this year we're gonna go again back to the performing aspect of the space that we are occupying, which is the Fields Institute. We want the artists to use that staircase. So one of the performances that will happen on April 11 actually will use the whole space to do a performance lecture.
So. Yeah, and the interesting thing for me of this specific project is the sort of like poetic relationship with those cabinets of curiosities, right? That people used to have in the 19th century, that they would collect artifacts or wonders, or like I remember someone in like Victorian England had like a hand of a mummy or something like that. They would have like, and it would be eventually all those items would become a museum. But so I thought it was kind of cool to do this. At least is how I interpreted that. It's sort of like a revival of that, using art in the unused spaces of university. Had a little interesting sting to it too. So
this is also, I think it also goes beyond. I mean, my point here was, and I realized this after I had picked those cabinets and I saw their potential. But for me is not just to bring people back to this idea of the cabinet curiosity, which is very good because it attracts people to come take a look. But this very element, calling people to come take a look, actually can be as well used to encourage people to reappropriate spaces in the university. The university, which is a public space, but it's been turned into a private space by the various administrations, and the fact that there's this assumption that academia is sort of citadel that is inaccessible. Even more so in the field of the sciences. People think the sciences are inaccessible, they're out there, they can be touched, they can be discussed, and they are neutral. Now, sciences can be very political, they can be very affective, and I think that people should reapproach science and should start discussing science and should have a more critical stand towards it. Not as in, oh, I hate science, I don't want to interact with it, but more like, okay, so is science really inaccessible? How can I understand better the role of science? How can I participate in the process of doing science? How can I advise in terms of policy, in terms of also like for my own knowledge in the whole idea of doing science? I think that people should like this could be a good opportunity for people to become more informed and achieve more knowledge.
Cool. Yeah, so that specific idea of engagement of people like into science, I think that's one of the things that you guys are doing that is very cool, that it goes sort of like beyond the usual science popularization efforts. And I know we're going to talk about the difference between art and science, but like science popularization, at least classically, is sort of like the scientist telling you how it is, and sometimes quote unquote dumbing it down so that you would understand, or at least trying to make it interesting as if the subject itself was not already interesting, right? So I think this idea of having an active engagement with both the practices in science and the practices like in technology for that matter too, it's a very cool thing to use art as a sort of like engagement, right? So I think it's really...
Yeah, using art as an engagement so that people can actually approach science better. But it's not just one way. So it's not a way for individuals to approach science through the arts so that they can understand better science. This would be science communication and science communicating better through art. This is the goal of science communication. And I had a lot of discussions with scientists about that. I think the problem has to be two-way. How can scientists communicate better science, and how can artists contribute with their research to science? And I think that this is something that is not being understood. There's always this tendency of both sides to look down upon each other. So the artists say, scientists do not understand our art. It's way more complex than just people being inspired and being spiritual and etc. etc. And the scientists are like, well, we are working with instruments, we're doing important work. So why would an artist come and use the instruments to pursue his or her own goals and research? I think that they could, artists and scientists could actually contribute to each other's work in a very meaningful way. And I've seen this happening in a bunch of circumstances. Once I saw artists and scientists writing papers together, papers that were going simultaneously in scientific publications, so very legitimate, and they were also going into arts publication. And we have examples here at the University of Toronto, we have examples in the University of Ottawa. And I think that also in Montreal at Concordia, through a bunch of labs that have been created by scientists and artists for these activities.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to put this in a historical perspective too, right? Because for a long time, the people doing art and doing science were sort of literally the same individuals, right? And then over the last 200-300 years maybe, there was sort of a separation. And from what I see in that field, it's because of specialization, we're able to get to enormous leaps in both areas, but then at the same time we lost certain things, that especially in the idea of curiosity, play, and experimentation, right? That I think now with these efforts are being sort of brought together, right? It's artists or illiterate or uninterested in science, and then scientists are illiterate and uninterested in art, and everybody loses because of that. At least that's the impression that I have.
Yeah, no, it's not just an impression. There is an intervention, there is an intention of the various governments to do this. The province of Ontario is very clear about it. It funds more the sciences than the arts. For them, it's all about STEM. And I was talking with someone, and when you're talking about STEAM, so science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics, so you put the A in the STEM, most of the times it's how can you embellish science through art. And we had actually a discussion in December about this, and it was very successful with a very sophisticated bunch of thinkers and a lot of questions from the audience. The fact that we had these governments who are pushing towards sciences because they are, I guess, economically more sound, but this is not the case. As a matter of fact, the arts are bringing as much as the sciences into the economy, and I don't understand why they keep them separated, because the two of them together would actually
it's so
make
interesting.
things more powerful.
I can't remember who said it, but they were talking about why are people flooding to, as tourists, for example, to Europe, to Italy, to your country, to Spain, to France, to these places that over the centuries have actually, although it was through religion, but they actually have invested massively in arts and in beauty and in content. And then over time, of course, the ROI of having creations is, it comes back. I can't remember what I saw this, but the cool thing, and then of course you have I think there's even studies in economics that show that the more investment you have in arts, it makes the community more vibrant, which makes the economy grow further, right? So it's sort of like a no-brainer that you have to explain, but since you have to explain, that's part of the work, right?
I don't know, look at the funding to the universities. I mean,
yeah.
It's all about technical, it's not just even physics and mathematics, it's all about the applied sciences, it's all about engineering and medicine. Like those are the professions that bring you status. And I don't know, are we going to have a whole society made of unemployed engineers who kind of think otherwise? Sorry, maybe you can take this away. Like I'm a little bit over polemic, but I'm very critical about it. I think that this is completely senseless. I don't understand what the hell are they thinking about.
Right, and I think like even on the sciences, I remember seeing the budget, for example, for JPL, like the Jet Propulsion Laboratory many years ago, and it was like 95% was for engineering and then 5% was for science. And for science as in like basic science research that not necessarily will bring immediate returns, but at the same time, all the technology we have today is based on at least 200-year-old basic science, right? So from Fourier series to make these recordings and all the other like areas that are like scientifically didn't have an applied goal when they were being created. Right?
Yeah, a lot of the times it's a failed experiment that turns into something else.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, of course.
Not necessarily in the sciences. No, like it's really like this like goal-oriented science and goal-oriented everything is really damaging research. Mm-hmm. Because when you're starting a research, like I see myself when I apply for SSHRC, or even my colleagues who are scientists who apply for NSERC.
Those are, just so that audience knows, those are like grants that the government in Canada specifically gives to researchers, correct?
The SSHRC is the Social Science and the Humanities Research Council, mm-hmm. and NSERC is the national science.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Science correspondent. No, yeah, you're right. When we are applying for these grants, we are forced to make to formulate a thesis and also to answer ourselves. Uh-huh. And so basically, like our work, as a colleague of mine was saying, is basically science fiction, because we are just doing these extrapolations, which will never happen. Well, we will not know whether or not we're getting the funding, but if we get the funding, probably chances are that our results will not be what we had anticipated in our grants. So.
Oh, interesting. So it's sort of like almost you have to create an advertisement for whatever.
Yeah, call it like that.
Whatever body of that will approve the grants will think will be either more prestigious or more advantageous. So like people have to adapt in a way, and it becomes what your colleague was saying, like sort of like a science fiction.
Yeah, not only, but you also have to simplify your work a lot, because committees that are judging your work are not necessarily in your specific field, and so they have to understand that. So you end up like, so basically like and I bet other scholars are like that. Like my biggest pain is trying to convey something that I still don't know how it's going to look, and it has to be as simple as possible. Mm-hmm. And you basically end up oversimplifying it. Mm-hmm. And hoping for the best.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. I even remember like just going back even I think on the Pioneer missions they had big discussions trying to decide if it was worth putting a camera in the spacecraft because they thought there might be no scientific use in the image, so they would rather put like other kinds of sensors and things. So it's interesting how it's sort of like a hiker. You have to battle to explore the unknown in a way, right? Yeah. So without having to have a specific something that you would actually know what the answer most likely is, right? Going from art and science, and then we talked a little bit about science popularization. How do you see the field here in Canada as opposed to other places around the world? Like, how do you see that?
I find the field here more very interesting. We have some specific items that I think places like Europe don't have. And I base this on events that I've seen succeeding in Europe, which will never and ever go well here in Canada. And it's not because they're not brilliant, they are absolutely brilliant. But here in Canada, whether we want it or not, and I find this very positive, I think there's still a lot of work to do, but we are kind of moving very, very, very slowly towards it. There is an initial acknowledgement or a start of an acknowledgement of scientific fields that are not Western, necessarily Western scientific areas. And there's also more acknowledgement, or at least I do acknowledge them, acknowledgement of non-Western science, like for example, traditional science, traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, also non-Western knowledge such as Chinese medicine and Chinese anatomy. And there's still a lot of work to do, but I think that because our country is somehow a little bit more open towards these kind of fields, I think that we will be able to incorporate them into our talks and having people pay attention to them as legitimate fields. They already have, I think. There's still a lot of discussions that I'm having with people where I am providing examples of indigenous knowledge that has outdone Western knowledge, and somebody says, yes, but this is very dangerous because people will think that by just doing simple gesture they will solve their problem. There's problems like cancer, for instance. You cannot cure cancer with clay. You cannot cure cancer like this. But it's not that. I think it's the concept of having a different system, and a system that sometimes works, that doesn't necessarily implies the use of calculations, predictions, cost-based activities that I think we should consider also as legitimate science. So a non-goal-oriented type of science. And I think that if we add to, I think that our activities as people who are negotiating across art and science, we should start incorporating also non-traditional science into that. And I think that Canada is the right place to do it.
Oh, cool. I haven't never thought about that way. Usually, I'm usually personally more on the skeptical camp for those kinds of things, in the sense that of course there's a lot of things, especially to boil down to very simple things like folk remedies that over time you see this actually works, but separating what works and what doesn't work would have to still go through the scientific process in a way. And at the same time you have the problem that I acknowledge that is a problem of today's time, that the current system for, let's say, deciding what's real knowledge, or it's let's say, quote unquote, accepted knowledge, it's very flawed, because sometimes, even with the whole thing with is sugar bad for you, then you pay a bunch of scientists to tell, it's a fat that is bad for you, and sugar is okay. It takes 50 years for those things to start coming to life.
But this works also for science, for traditional science. Well, I'm calling it traditional, but it's really not for Western science.
Right.
Western science is selling you things, quoting them with this scientific talk and with these sort of statistics and data, and they bring you evidence, but we don't know if this is true or not. I mean, consider that in the 1930s, scientists were legitimating smoke as a treatment even. And they were putting a stamp over radioactive items, and they had the radioactive pills that were circulating and caused a lot of cancer, and they put in circulation a lot of cures that were then proven as like causing cancer or killing people or causing more troubles than they were supposed to cure. So it's the thing about science is a profoundly experimental activity, but so are the other sciences.
Yeah, it's messy.
And it is messy, but it is actually very unfair to consider Western science as more legitimate than other sciences because they both fail.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like that's at least on the subjects that you were interested in, of like this relationship of like art science and then engagement of the public in a critical analysis of it. Then, independently of where, because I know from all the people that I talk to, you will have people in all the spectrums, like from the pure, let's say, traditionalist quote unquote scientists to the people that are, for these guys would be considered the woo scientists, but there certainly is a truth in all of them, right? I mean, truth in all of them, like, I'm sure no one has the complete picture. And so it's interesting that this idea of like engaging people to think for themselves, in the end, independent of where in the spectrum you are, it's the ultimate scientific principle, right? Of like, let's search for knowledge and know that it's never done, right? Yeah. That we are dumb and we are the easiest people to fool, as Richard Feynman once said, right?
We rely on the authorities to make our choices.
Yeah, that's the other thing. That's one of the
big mistake.
That's one of the things that I find so fascinating and so interesting in this, let's say, disruptive nature of art science like relationships, because you're trying by definition through the creative vision of art and the inquiry of scientific thinking, you are actually trying to go against, or at least beyond, whoever is the authority in that field trying to impose as the narrative, right? And I think that's the power and the danger. Maybe that's why they don't want to fund these things.
It is the power and the danger, that's right. There's this group of artists, the Tissue Culture Arts and Science Project, I don't remember. Mm-hmm. Sorry,
it's okay.
I don't remember. Like,
we'll insert in show notes later on.
Yeah, two are. Well, I'm thinking about two artists in particular, Oron Katz and Jon Azur. They were working together and they become very famous for creating these tissue culture art, which is a biology-based art on tissue culture, and they created this semi-living. The thing is, okay, this is more complicated than that, but the thing is that their work is very ambiguous. It can be taken as way to popularize the science and a certain activity within science, but it could also be taken as a way to criticize science. But what is very interesting is they let the audience decide. So when somebody tells them, oh, but your work is being misunderstood by scientists, by popular science, and also by the audience, what you say, and they say, well, but this is the point of our artwork. This is the point of art. The fact that it is staying there, it's ambiguous, and for those people who want to listen, there's a question for them. So how do you respond? Do you choose to go deeper? Do you choose to do a little bit more research? Do you choose to become more interested in this field? Or do you just choose to buy whatever is told to you? Or just to base your judgment upon the first impression? So I find this very interesting, something that not all artists and scientists like to go for.
It's very interesting.
Letting go is very difficult. Like I've been trying to do it with my own art, and it is very difficult because you're trying to anticipate how the audience will react, and you can't. And sometimes I get a little bit frustrated, but sometimes I'm like, okay, so I just want to let go and see what happens. And most of the times, this is the way to go. This is what makes the art more lively and people more interested.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. And even this reminded me. I don't know if you know the work of this artist called Iris Howler. She's a German artist. She's this will be a little tangent in our conversation, but to me, it's the best art installation work I've ever seen in my life. By far, there's no comparison. She did at the AGO, and I don't think she will do this again, so I will spoil it. But she basically did as if they were doing an archaeological research in the Grunge building. The AGO is the Art Gallery of Ontario, and you would go in and then you would see the work that people were doing, and in that house circa 17, I think 18th, 19th century, and then you would go in and then you would see that they found these art objects created by this person that used to work in that house. That was the house of the mayor, if I'm not mistaken. And then you would go through and they will show you all the research.
This was in the Grange house?
Yes. And then you would go through, you would see everything, and then they would even show, how the archaeologists are working on this. You would go to their office and take a look, sort of like a regular curatorial tour. Then, if you want to learn more about it, they would give you a piece of paper. There's sort of like a newsletter thing. When you open it, and I even get like goosebumps just remembering it, because I remember it's like, oh cool, you get connected to this character, this woman from a century ago that was doing this wax art in the place and this and that, and then you would go home and then hopefully you would open this photocopied paper, and then they would start talking about the research, blah 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 blah. This is an artwork by Artist Holler. None of it is true. Yeah, so and they had that implication of, is it real science? Why do you trust that this is real science? Just because you see the instruments, and I'm leaving the whole story behind, but it's sort of like the same idea of doing this, and then people were criticizing, but you're not telling at the end the audience that it's not true. It's like, yeah, that's part of science. You don't know what's true or not.
It was very interesting to see with the cabinet project, because the cabinet project is in public spaces, so we cannot really put a lot of really big descriptions of it. Mm-hmm. So we did a couple of tours, but most of the times people were let to think for themselves, and especially in very public spaces. Like we had 3 cabinets, which have become, by the way, our main exhibition space, because they are so close to the Fields Institute. So we install things there, and people are really interested. That is a corridor that is very public, so people are using it to go from a building to the other, from the Koffler building where the students' services are, to the Baen Center, which is where computer science and a lot of other mathematics, a lot of disciplines are. So there's a lot of traffic there, and sometimes people are stopping there and they look at the artworks and they don't have anything, they've never seen anything like that, they never got exposed to bioart, for instance. Mm-hmm. They start thinking aloud and they make hypotheses and they try to figure out what they are. And it's beautiful to see. I would like to put a camera so that I can see how people react.
You should.
I still have to find a way to record what they think, because it's just beautiful the way they interpret the work, and they are all completely different, because they are all coming from different disciplines, because this is a place of passage, right? So it's in between buildings, and people from drama are going across, and people from computer science are coming, and administrators are going. So yeah,
that's really cool. And I think that would be a cool thing to see, as part of even as a research, to see what people
maybe we should put a camera there. It's a little bit spying on people.
Well, they already, I'm sure at U of T everything's being recorded all the time with the camera, so
definitely.
No, that's very cool. So can you talk, one thing you mentioned was this idea of bio art that I think maybe not many people will know. It's sort of like an emergent field. Can you talk a little bit about what bio art is? Because I find it very, very interesting.
Bioart is very complicated. Yes. Because bioart can be, I've seen it in different forms. The field I become very fascinated in bioart is when artists are using biology as their medium. It means that they're using bacteria, viruses, well, viruses not too much, but bacteria. They're using wet stuff to make their own work. And this is work that is very process-based. It changes across time. and therefore sometimes is not really accepted by galleries.
Oh, right.
And this is why places like cabinets are the best, right? Or non-conventional places.
Right.
And there's also artists who are creating artworks that are finished, but when you see an art finished in the gallery, you don't realize that in order to become like this, the art has gone through a series of processes that have been taking place in a lab. So artists who are working in labs, especially biological labs, are also bioartists, and they don't necessarily use biology as a medium, but the process of doing science in the biological lab can be the medium. And it becomes very problematic when these artworks are exposed in the gallery, because what about all the work that came before? It's still part of the artwork, right? How do you explain the process? Then what else? With bioart, I mean, there's also performance art. There's people who are creating... Well, there's an artist I would like to bring to Canada again. He came twice a long time ago, but I want him back. He's doing performance art, but he's also a bioartist because he's creating fake experiments that are making up science fictional characters or new organisms. And of course, there's a lot of truth and a lot of falseness into what he's doing, but that's the beauty of it. He really wants people to pay attention. So, so this is performance art. It doesn't necessarily have art science, but it has
the spirit of
the spirit is there, and it's biological science.
So it's like a broad
field. Bioart is a broad field. I've also had like one of the artists who's coming to Toronto in a few weeks has created artwork that have, since she started doing them, like basically dried out. So now what she's exposing is basically like canvas with stuff that is going to be there basically forever. But it's grown before, and the artist might or might not choose to show the process before. So bioart has a lot of potentials. Then of course there's books that are trying to classify it, but I haven't really quite.
It's sort of like too early or unnecessary sometimes, right?
It's an emergent field, so.
It's that and the whole like do-it-yourself movement for like there's a lot of art being done with electronics and Arduino and all those kinds of things too, that I think you in the ArtSci Salon you guys are working as well, right? With like interactive things with sensors and all those things.
There's artists. We've invited artists who are working with technologies with big data as well. Some of them are highly experimental, so it's the different type of lab they're working in. It's not necessarily bioart, but it's another type of...
Yeah, but I think that's a very exciting time that you have so much art being done, and even if like a traditional gallery will not be the place to do it, it's probably even more interesting to show it as a living thing in other kinds of
I think this is the future of this type of science based art. The fact that like we might or might not be able to exhibit our work in a traditional gallery or in a museum, simply because in a museum you have stuff that would last for years, if not decades or centuries. But bioart might not last that amount of time. So the work is extremely ephemeral and disappearing very, very soon. So what do you do? And I think people are very concerned about it. There's a lot of concern about conservation. This is a field that has been on going on for the electronic arts. because at a certain point electronic art deals with obsolescence. But if electronic art is dealing with obsolescence, so the software that no longer works, or the computer where you're supposed to show the art that is no longer available, or the code is not working. But then in biology, in bioart, the problem is similar and different at the same time. The problem here is not obsolescence, but it's how the work will look in a few years. So the work is disappearing.
Yeah, and it's evolving anyway, right? So it's that's cool. Two final things I wanted to ask you is regarding like your experience with this bridge between art and science and what you're doing specifically in Toronto and now expanding to other places in Ontario and hopefully getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Finger crossed.
Then for people, let's say that you have an artist or a scientist or both of them, like what would you say to a person that is interested, like say a student or a scientist or an artist that is interested in getting into this kind of field or to learning more about what they can do for their specific interest in science and art? How would you recommend them to go about it?
Oh, that's $1 million question. I think that the first thing they should be doing is try to I'm trying to think what I did in order to become interested in that. I guess try to be as curious as possible. Try to clear your mind from all the assumptions and all you've heard about science and art. And I think that these events that we are doing are actually good to open people's mind. Because I noticed how they change throughout years. It's a slow process. But our audience has become this fabulous cradle of inspiration that never ceases to surprise me.
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you would say that I love this idea of like blank slate, follow your curiosity, sort of like usually how I finish my podcast about that kind of stuff. So you would say like to go and learn about other subjects, or maybe try to either create things like you were doing here, or to try to find other institutions that are doing these gatherings of art and science, or maybe approach a fellow like science student or a scientist. How can we work together? Like I know it's a slow process. I'm just trying to think of like a person that is not necessarily in the environment of that we are right now. How would you like go about trying to do that kind of stuff?
Yeah, unfortunately, this is kind of a new-ish field. I am very sad to say that you will not find inspiration from the institutions, because institutions are not open, and they can't be open to interdisciplinary approaches. They really can't. They are not like their hands are tied. So I think really it's down to one's initiative. Do not despair, though. I was trying to think what I was doing myself. I was attending a lot of just go to a lot. Just keep yourself curious. Attend a lot of events in different disciplines, even if you don't understand them. Just go. Just go. There will be something that inspires you. Some of them will make you really sleep, but some of them are really like cringe-inducing. Some of them have very arrogant people talking, but it doesn't matter. Like this is already like a variety that you're getting in, right? Like take in as much as you can, and I think this will be the advice. Like a good this will be the advice. So try to do as much as you can. I was trying to advise my students to be open to a lot of different things, and this is what I've been trying to do this year with my classes. Sometimes I fail, sometimes I see these people flourishing and really changing their mind. You do one at a time. You can't
Change
put,
one person.
if you have one person is still
butterfly
more than
effect
yes.
Yes. Cool. So Roberta, where should people are interested in your work? Where should they go to? Like online? Where can people find you? And if they're interested in the ArtSci Salon or in your research specifically in your artwork? Okay,
so we have a website, which today means nothing. It's just an archive. The website is artscisalon.com.
Mm-hmm.
That's where all the links to all the social media are as well. We have a mailing list. Mm-hmm. But check us out. We are on Instagram. We are on Twitter. We are on Facebook. And if you go and look for ArtSci Salon, you will find us. It's like facebook.com/ArtSci Salon, Twitter, ArtSci_Salon, and I don't remember anymore. Instagram, I think, is ArtSci Salon as well. So, yeah.
We'll put links on the show notes for everything. And cool. So
we have a YouTube channel too.
Oh, cool. I didn't know about that.
With all the documentation and that.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I should make it a little bit more visible because
it's always a work in progress to put in all these things.
Because YouTube, like people, like for example, when I invite people to give a talk and they say, "Oh my God, what am I supposed to say?" Especially the scientists, I usually point them to the YouTube channel, and it's like, "Oh, this is so nice that you document everything," and so it's a good way to advertise our work, and also a good way to archive everything.
Mm-hmm. And it's a way also, I guess, for people that for whatever reason can't come to the talks to come and take a look and see what people are saying, and even if it's in retrospect, you'll probably get something out of that. Cool. Yeah. So, Roberta, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
So, that's it for today's show. Thank you for listening to the Wanderings podcast. You can find show notes and links at pedrobonatto.com/podcast. If you like the show, I would love if you could share it with your friends or leave a review on iTunes. If you want to get in touch with me, you can find me on all social media at Pedro Bonatto. I would love to hear from you. You can find my photography work at pedrobonatto.com. The music for the Wanderings podcast is provided by the Blue Dot Ensemble, a music and dance group exploring traditions from all over the planet, where I am one of the founders and the lead drummer. You can find us at bluedotensemble.com. So tune in next week for another show. Until then, I urge you to keep following your curiosity, and I'm looking forward to our next Wanderings together.